Hey, Patricia.
Hello, Kim.
How was your weekend?
My weekend was okay. It's just been busy here at the gallery. We deinstall our previous show, and we're going to be installing the MFA exhibition starting next week. We're opening on the 17th, April 17th. It's going to be great, but it's going to be busy for the next couple of days.
Well, first of all, deinstalling is no joke. It's like if you think installing's hard, packing it back up is harder. So sorry about that.
It's okay.
It's also like, do you get sad when shows come down?
um, Not really. I guess I get excited to reflect on the show and on the experience, and we just get excited about the next project. Also, it's an opportunity to sort of be in touch with the objects again in a more direct way, packing them and treating them with care, returning them back to their origin. It's fun.
Oh, that's nice.
What about you?
Um, I was in New York City last week and I did a few interviews while you were on spring break. And one of the things, I was there with my family. And one of the things we did was usually I go to New York and I'm like, art, 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 art all the time. But my family's like, let's actually see things. So we each saw plays. I saw Glengarry Glen Ross, and my husband and my child saw The Outsiders. And then we also went to the Museum of the City of New York. And it was amazing. I'd never been there. And it was like really incredible. And they had a Shirley Chisholm exhibit. And she was this incredible powerhouse politician who was the first Black woman elected to Congress and ran for president. That was just like an incredible exhibition. Holy cow. So it was a very busy week. But we have an incredible guest, so let's get on with it. Welcome to The Art Equation.
Welcome to The Art Equation, a podcast from Now Be Here. I'm one of your hosts, Patricia Ortega, and our historian and independent curator.
I'm your other host, Kim Schoenstatt, a contemporary artist and organizer of Now Be Here, a directory of and for women and non-binary artists.
On this podcast, we have a little charla, a little bachipapo about making art and making exhibitions. We invite fellow artists, curators, archivists, and people from different areas of the art world to share their knowledge and their experience.
We are curious about what goes on in the day-to-day of arting. We want to talk shop, get in the weeds about what goes into art shows, talk with the makers and the doers of the art world. Welcome to The Art Equation.
Today, we have the honor and pleasure of speaking with Elizabeth Botten. So, we wanted to give listeners a sneak peek into the work that you do at the Archives of American Art and the ways in which you have actively and over the years helped shape the public face of the institution. We have a biography to read for our listeners, and then we will get into some juicy questions and conversation about Elizabeth's path and experience as a reference specialist at the Archives of American Art here in Washington, D.C.
Elizabeth Botten is a reference specialist at the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, where she is part of the team providing public access to more than 6,500 collections. In addition to being editor of the Archives of American Art blog, she is the co-founder of the Archives Usability Program and has served as interim social media manager. Her exhibition, Artists and Their Models, received favorable coverage in outlets including Hyperallergic, The Washington Post, and NPR's Morning Edition. Botten has co-authored articles and spoken at conferences including the Society of American Archives and the Art Libraries Society of North America. She has written on topics as varied as the San Francisco Artist Soapbox Derby, woohoo! Rare children's books, and artist remembrances for publications including the Archives of American Art Journal, Smithsonian Magazine, and the Hossack Institute Journal. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you today.
So, just to get us started, I mean, we met at the Archives of American Art, I think.
I think did you have a fellowship at the National Portrait Gallery?
Yes, that's right. I was doing a fellowship at the National Portrait Gallery with Taína Caragol, and I was there looking at I think the work of Emilio Sanchez, at the papers of Emilio Sanchez, and because there were some connections I wanted to make between the photographs on the portfolio that I was working on and other institutions within the Smithsonian. And so that's where we met. I was looking at the papers, and you were so kind to help me navigate the archive, and that's how our friendship started.
Yes, and I also remember you were looking at one drawing that was so large we actually had to look at it in the conference room where we could
Yes.
put tables together. It's at least 8 or 10 feet long, this particular drawing.
Yes. And you were fascinated by the sketches of this circus carp, was it?
There are a lot of circus drawings. There was one in particular which was like a sort of negative silhouette of lights, and we had a long conversation about it that went everywhere from the circus to banyan trees.
Yes. I remember that. Yeah, Emilio Sanchez is was a Cuban American painter and visual artist who studied and lived in New York City, but he traveled through the Caribbean and was very inspired by the architecture, but sort of vernacular architecture of the Caribbean. And he's known for that work, but the collection at the Archives of American Art was very interesting to me. It had lots of photographs and these different and quite interesting sketches and drawings. So that is how we met.
And if I'm allowed to plug Patricia, she wrote a wonderful piece for our blog about Emilio Sanchez's vernacular photography and source photography. And I'll also add that Sanchez had a stamp that was released by the U.S. Post Office maybe 3 years ago. So he's a wonderful artist, and he is definitely worth looking up because his work is really beautiful.
Yeah, well, you were the one who pushed me to write the text that we created together. So thank you for that. We know you've been at the Smithsonian Institution's Archives of American Art for a while, but we want to know how many years, how that sort of started for you.
So I joined the archives in 1999 when I graduated from college. And I was initially hired as a temporary employee. I got very lucky. I tell this story all the time, but in my junior year of college, I broke my leg and had to leave school early. And I was planning on having the easiest senior year ever, and I ended up having to go back and make up 16 credits and also overload in order to graduate on time. So I didn't have any time to do job hunting or find an internship. I had no post-college plans. And my former boss was friends with one of my professors who recommended me for this job. So it was very lucky, but also if I had not been able to, hang with the program, I would have been out of there. But I studied art history, and I do work at an archives, and most of the people in my office have library backgrounds. But since I worked in the reference department where we work with the public, we do small amounts of remote research on behalf of people who can't come in. We work with researchers who come in person to use original materials. She really emphasized, my former boss, hiring people with art history backgrounds, and I studied art history and English. So it was a great fit for me. I didn't really have an archives background. I wasn't really aware of archives. I hadn't really used them in writing papers in school, but I just immediately fell in love with the archival research and discovering collections, which we can get into as well.
Yes, definitely. And I want to know how it has changed, because you've been there for a while. So I want to know how it has changed from the time that you started till now. But before we do that, just for our listeners, if you can tell us, what are the Archives of American Art? What is this place? And also, when was it founded, and what is its mission?
Well, the Archives of American Art was founded in Detroit in 1954 by Edgar P. Richardson, who was at that time the director of the Detroit Institute of Arts, and Lawrence A. Fleischman, who was a businessman and art collector. And they sort of got together and had this idea that there should be a central repository for American art research. So their idea was to go around to different historical societies and artists and microfilm collection materials to make a research center. And during this process, they came to realize that they could really benefit from collecting original papers as well. So that was how the collection got built up. And then in 1970, we joined the Smithsonian, where we've been ever since. You know, it's interesting because there are some aspects of my job that have not changed at all since I started working there 25, almost 26 years ago. Such as working with researchers, doing reference questions. That doesn't really change at all. The standards are really high for our research services. It's the same methods that I use looking in different collections. You know, you follow the paths where the research takes you to find the answers that the collections reveal. But the questions always change, so you never really get bored, even though it seems like, oh, I should be doing some different thing after all this time, but it's always a different thing, even though it's the same essential work. You know, things that have changed are things like editing the blog, and I'm actually right now in the process of doing my first oral history interview with an artist, so that's been really fascinating. Even before I started at the archives, you know, back in the 70s and 80s, it was a bit different because people who process collections would also do reference work. And I think some of our work has gotten more siloed, and we've also gotten a lot more technological. I mean, when I first started, we didn't have fully digitized collections online, and we have almost 300 collections that you can sit down in your pajamas in the middle of the night and like do your art research. That's different. I mean, technology has really changed a lot. Back in the day, I remember putting reel-to-reel tapes on a recorder and making a cassette copy to serve to researchers in the reading room. Now everything is digital, and we don't even serve AV in the reading room anymore. We have it digitized, and then we make interviews available to researchers remotely all across the world. So I guess technology is probably the biggest change.
I see.
Okay, I'm really curious because we had Julie Wolfe from the Getty. She's a sculpture conservator, and she talked about the value of being able to interview an artist in terms of materials and conservation. And so that seems to be like a different kind of interview than you were doing.
Oh, well, the archives has, I think, the largest oral history program on the subject of visual arts in the world. We have nearly 2,600 oral history interviews, and about 1,800 of those have transcripts that are available online. And typically the tack we take is a more biographical approach. Techniques and materials, all of that can come into an oral history interview. And they can all be a little bit different, but it's often a lot about background, education, who have you worked with. But often with a lot of these interviews, what also gets mixed in are really good stories.
I bet they're really good.
I remember the one that you did on, was it you, Catherine Opie?
No, I didn't do the interview.
Okay.
So we also have a podcast.
Oh, it was the
and
podcast.
the podcast draws from stories from our oral history interviews and uses clips. We just finished season 4, and season 4, I'm not going to be able to name all the artists off the top of my head, but the narrative season 4 was about older artists who are still working. But I narrated an episode that featured Catherine Opie's oral history, so I didn't do the oral history with Opie.
Okay.
I'm curious, what kind of people use the archives? How does this work? How does research at the archives work?
So collections are digitized. The data is sort of hung around a finding aid. So a finding aid is like an inventory of a collection, and there's different series. So typically there'll be a biographical series, so that's where you would find a resume, maybe a passport. I mean, collections can also be very varied in how big they are and what they contain. Then typically you'll find correspondence. There might be exhibition records for a gallery or even an artist. There's usually a photograph series. Sometimes you find audio visual material like films or interviews, printed material like exhibition invitations or pamphlets. there's really a broad range of materials that you find in this sort of material that we collect because we collect personal papers of artists. We also collect gallery records. But if you want to come in to the archives, I mean, we are a public archive. We're open to anyone who's high school age or over. You would make requests through our website. We pull them out and then you come in and we'll give you a little orientation about how to use the materials. And then we just sort of leave you be to look through and do your research. But we get all different kinds of researchers. I mean, most of our researchers who come in are graduate and PhD level students or curators, independent art historians or writers. Sometimes people from auction houses come, or people from galleries doing research. We also get a fair number of people working on genealogy research. It's really special when you're in the reading room, and we don't serve oral history interviews in the reading room anymore, but I have memories back in the old days of being in the reading room with someone who had never heard like their grandfather's voice, and then they get to listen to it for the very first time. It's a really special thing to get to see. I don't remember which collection this was, but once a young woman came in with a couple of members of her family, and she had studied with an artist, and he had saved all of these class assignments, and she got to bring her family in and look at the papers, and her assignment was there, and it was really special to see her experience that her work was in the Smithsonian with her family. And those are, those are things that are really meaningful to me in my work.
I mean, listening to people, even that you're researching, because it's been my experience, it does something, right?
Yeah.
It does something. It's like time traveling.
And I've had this moment. I mean, I'm not completely jaded about archives or anything, but there are times when you're like holding a letter, and it could be a really boring, mundane letter, but Georgia O'Keeffe signed it, and you're like, Georgia O'Keeffe held this piece of paper in her hands, and now I'm holding it in my hands. And there's something really exciting about that. And I know it can sometimes be disappointing. Sometimes there are things that are very fragile that we can no longer serve, but there's still an awful lot that you can touch and hold in your hands. Sometimes artists come to the Smithsonian has an artist research fellowship that we've supported, and they come and do research on all manner of things.
I was a SARF.
You were?
I was. So the Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship shortens down to SARF. And I was a SARF in 2012.
It's wonderful.
And it's a really cool fellowship. I encourage artists whose practice might benefit from it to apply for it. It used to be that you had to get nominated, but now I think that it's opened up that people can just apply. And I actually came to the Archives of American Art to do research on curator Jan Vandermark, who is the director of the MCA Chicago, and Esther McCoy, who was an architecture writer. And I visited the archives to do this research. I was presented with a table and a bunch of boxes with a lot of files, and it was totally overwhelming. What I didn't really put together was that when he would write his notes, it wasn't in English. So that was kind of like oops. Esther's was all in English, but it was interesting to me because you were talking about the finding aid, and that was sort of like the first place that I had to go to, right? You say, okay, I want to research this thing, and I have to go to the finding aid, and then I have to sort it out. And I apologize, listeners. I actually live close to a small airport, and they seem to be doing training today, so I apologize for the airplane in the background. But one of the things I found really interesting was that most of my discoveries weren't the things that I went there to look at. It was all the other stuff in the boxes. So does that happen a lot? Because I can't be the only one.
It happens all the time, and it happens a lot to me too, because one of the wonderful things about working in reference is that I get into all these collections to answer questions for people who can't come in, and that's often when I stumble across things that are of interest to me. And of course, I diligently do the work for the researchers, but I'm often making an extra photocopy to tuck away in my files to go back to, and I've just come across all kinds of things in that way.
It was interesting to me too, because when I was there, it was like 2012, so it was slightly before the full-on digital revolution, and I needed a camera to kind of take pictures of things, but there was a very clear protocol. There was even a slip of paper that came with the box that was like, this is what so you would have a reference. You were like archiving your own archival research.
Right.
That was fascinating.
Yeah, and there's really two reasons. One is copyright. We actually don't own all the copyright to everything that is in the archives. People can donate collections without transferring the copyright to the public domain, which is, we're a government, quasi-government agency. So the work we do is in the public domain. But also, if you donate papers, typically you're donating a lot of letters that other people wrote to you. But if they don't donate the letters themselves, like you can only donate work that you've made yourself with the copyright to work you've made yourself. So one thing is that libraries and archives use copyright notices as a form of protection. So if somebody were to photocopy a bunch of letters and publish them without the permission of the estate, we can't control that, but we put copyright notices up so researchers know that they would need to do due diligence with that process. The other reason is that a lot of people are doing sort of preliminary research and they might need to come back to us later for a photograph, for a book or something. It will help you know which collections it is from because, someone can come and spend 2 weeks or even a month looking at one collection and going through it really thoroughly. Sometimes people come for 2 weeks or a month and go through 30 collections. And when you're looking at that much material, it can be hard to remember precisely where something came from. So it's also a marker that helps you, and it also helps us a lot in finding materials for you for reproductions.
No, I found it incredibly useful, actually.
And we still print them out, except now people just take pictures with their phones instead of cameras.
Right.
The letters part was interesting because I was talking with somebody over the weekend. Is it true that if you have correspondence between, say, me and Patricia, Patricia donates her archives to you, the Archives of American Art, and I'm like, hey, that was kind of sensitive stuff that we talked about. I would really prefer not for the public to see those letters. Could I put a restriction on that correspondence?
All of the restrictions come from the donors as the owners of the physical objects. I'd have to do some asking around about situations where something like this might have come up.
Yeah, because letters in specific, like she would have my letters to her and I would have Patricia's letters to me. So you only have the complete conversation if you're looking at both archives.
Right. Sometimes we're lucky enough to have both sides.
Which takes me to a question I've been wanting to ask. Do you think that artists intentionally leave some messages or marks? Do you think artists actively think about what they're leaving behind and what might become a public archive? Tell us about this a little bit.
Well, I do.
Oh, please.
I think it depends, and I think you see that in different ways in different collections. And families do this too with deceased artists. I think sometimes there is a concern about presenting a career in a certain way, and I think that's totally fair. Two examples that I often talk about. One is Florence Noel Bassett, the designer. She gave us a small amount of papers, and it's a beautiful collection, and it was like so beautifully presented. She actually had boxes fabricated for the collection. One is this like beautiful white linen box, and there were labels on the side that had her graphic mark on them, and everything was beautifully arranged and color coded. And that says something to me about who she was as an artist and how she approached her work. Around the same time, I was helping our registrar unpack a collection. And I don't know how much of this is like just fabricated in my memory and how much of it actually happened. And collections come in all different sort of states. So this is not a judgment on the collection itself when I say this, but it was a real mess. It wasn't very organized. Everything was sort of haphazard. And a lot of things come in that way when you're cleaning your studio out. But I remember like we took a lid off a box and in my memory, like a poof of smoke came out of it, like cigarette smoke. I don't think that happened. But I do 100% remember that we found popcorn kernels in the box. So, like, you can contrast those two collections. People work in different ways. Their brains work in different ways. It's not a judgment. But I do think that people make decisions about what letters to put in and what to not put in. And our collectors, they talk to people about making donors understand that things go into a public collection. They could potentially be digitized. And some donors throughout our history have chosen to put certain types of restrictions on collections. We have like a publication restriction, so someone would need to get permission to quote from the collection or to republish a photograph. And then there are some collections that have an access restriction, so you need to get written permission just to access the collection. And sometimes those things also expire after someone has passed away or a certain period after they've passed away. If someone is concerned about sensitive material, then they feel like they have more control over it. But then once they've passed away, then it gets opened up.
I was asking you because when I was in Paris looking at Sardou's archive, it's mostly in French that he's speaking, right? But then all of a sudden he will say these things in Spanish in the middle of a phrase.
Yeah.
And I'll be like, oh, here I am, I got you. It's like these little things. And he was very self-conscious of what he was leaving behind because he was part of the post-structuralists. He was thinking about the traces and the archive as he was creating. So to me, these are very intentional marks that he's leaving in the archive. He called them like filigranas, which is like the little marginal notes or marginal decorative patterns in books, especially in manuscripts. And so that's where that question comes from. But so when you open the box and there's this smoke from cigarettes, smell coming out, then what do you do with that? Like, to me, that is part of the archive. That is part of the actual preserved object. Do you have to clean it up? What happens?
When we get collections in, even if they're not fully processed right away, so processing is the arrangement of the materials, which results in a finding aid, which helps access because we have a better idea, more complete picture of what's in the papers. But when they first come in, when they're accessioned, we put materials into archival boxes and they get labeled. But if something is in a fragile state or papers need protection or a certain type of housing, we do that when they first come in before we serve them to researchers, so the papers are protected. And we're also, not every archive serves materials that are not processed, but we do. Generally, there's at least a rough box inventory, but then sometimes there are times when you kind of just have to go through all the boxes because they haven't been organized yet. But we feel like it's important to provide that access to the material, even if they're not initially as easy to use as they will be once they're processed.
Hearing you talk about some of these papers and objects, the archives has collections that are not only artist collections, but curators also. And can you speak a little bit, because it's the Archives of American Art, but it also has the papers of critics, curators, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, we collect materials that tell the story of the history of the visual arts of the United States. So that covers gallery records, critics. We have the Walt Kuhn papers, who was one of the organizers of the 1913 Armory Show. And we have all kinds of planning documents for that show. We have a letter that he wrote to his wife where he drew a little button with a pine tree on it that became the design for the button that was passed out, and we have one of the original 1913 buttons. You can see it on our website.
That's cool.
But we also have all of the scrapbooks of all the clippings about the show and lots of really, to me, amusing, satirizing cartoons about Duchamp and the nude descending the staircase. But, we have all of these documents that you really can't tell the story of art in the United States without the archives.
Without them, yes. Yes.
That's really incredible.
You run the blog, but you've also done some exhibition projects.
Yes. In 2014, I did an exhibition called Artists and Their Models, which was really, really fun.
Sounds fascinating.
So it wasn't a show that had a thesis. It was more about gathering materials in the archives related to artist models. But I presented them thematically. So we looked at life drawing. I did a little section about animals. I did a section about the work of the model, which revolved a lot around a woman named Florence Allen, who was an artist model in San Francisco, and she was the founder of the San Francisco Models Guild.
Wow.
And
guild.
Her work around professionalizing the profession of modeling.
Wow.
She's one of my very favorite people in the archives.
What year is this?
The Guild was founded in, I think, 1946.
Oh, yeah,
post-war. We actually have her, union card in her dues book. And her collection is very small, but it's very fascinating because she was a real woman around town. She actually wrote a gossip column
Oh, wow.
for a local newspaper, and she worked at the old spaghetti factory in San Francisco. But she posed for like everyone in San Francisco, and she's just such a big, wonderful personality. But she worked really hard for models because it was not always an easy profession. Posing is hard. Standing still is hard. Often artist studios are cold and dirty, and you're standing there often naked in a dusty, cold room. And she fought and worked really hard for things like breaks, but she also insisted that models be professional. So she taught a class about art modeling and emphasized things like being on time, being professional.
So she was the focus of the exhibition, or just like one case study within?
She was like one of the featured models that was in the exhibition. It was fairly broad, looking at the sort of the history that we could tell through collections at the archives.
And I'm curious, like, as paper-based archives, like faxes and letters and notes, as we're moving towards the digital, how does that affect your work?
I don't know that it really does affect my work. Technology has always been evident in our collections throughout the last few hundred years. I think the earliest letters we have are from the 18th century. But we have telegrams, we have typewritten letters, we have printed out emails. So, and I think collecting has been changing over the last few years as more people are more digitally based. It just changes how we serve materials to researchers.
Fascinating, fascinating. Elizabeth, before we move on to our last question, what do you enjoy the most about working at the Archives of American Art?
I can't choose just one thing.
Just say everything that comes to your mind.
That's good.
I mean, I have really wonderful colleagues, and we all really care about our mission and our work. And that makes such a difference in wanting to come to work every day. And we also have really wonderful researchers. It's been such a pleasure to get to know all of these scholars over the years. And I really, really just enjoy getting into collections and the discovery that comes from finding things. And we think of discovery as like making things accessible and discoverable. But I should say, like, for me, I try not to say things like, I discovered this. You know, there was a collector that brought the collection in. There was a processor who went through the papers and organized and made a finding aid and probably clued me into knowing that I need to go to this folder to look for this thing that I'm looking for, that I need. You know, and I'm on the public facing end, so there's a lot of work and it's a whole continuum of work that makes my work possible.
And you are very generous with your engagement with the public. At least I remember when I came in, how willing you were to show me more and to sort of point me to the other places where there was interesting material. And I know that from the perspective of researchers and scholars and artists who come to the archives, you are that person who so generously facilitates the materials, but also inspire people to look deeply and look for more, which is very appreciated.
I mean, it's really exciting to me to have a little part in making a connection between a scholar and a collection. And sometimes they point me to things too.
Yeah, you're like a tourist guide. So one last question is, what are some of your favorite objects in the collection?
Oh, well, I have many. I have many, many favorite objects. I talked about Florence Allen a little bit. I mean, she's always someone who's very close to my heart. One collection that I love is the Isabel Bishop papers, and there's about 3 folders of letters, most of which are illustrated, from her friend Warren Chappell. And one of my very favorite letters is its ear with arms and legs walking around, followed by a giant mouth that is very clearly talking to it. And at the bottom it just says communication.
That's perfect.
Oh, wow.
And that collection is digitized, so you could go find that online. I have many favorite oral history interviews. One interview was with Eleanor Dickinson, who was a big part of the model show, and I was so privileged to meet her because she passed away a few years later, but her granddaughter lived in Washington, so she was visiting and she came to see the exhibition, and I was able to tour through it with her. And she tells a story in her oral history interview about an exhibition she did at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco called Line Drawing. This was in 1975, and she basically set up her studio in the museum and drew from models for the run of the exhibition. And it was a little controversial because she was hoping that the models could be in bathing suits, and I guess the museum administration felt like that was a little too sexy. So she was, and this story's in her interview, but she was also telling me this in the exhibition. She's like, so I had to sew all these like chemises for the models, but on the very last day of the show, it was a Sunday, and I guess there were not any museum administration people around. So all the models decided just to throw caution to the wind and throw their chemises to the wind.
Oh my God.
And they were just all like hanging around, but like it was a super popular exhibition.
Incredible. I love it.
Another thing that I absolutely love, we have multiple copies of this magazine across collections, one of which is the Esther McCoy papers. But we have copies of a magazine called Trek, which was the magazine of a Japanese incarceration camp. And Mineo Kubo was the arts editor of this magazine. So it was like writers and artists that was all created within the camp. And to me, it's like a real beautiful testament of what you can do with art and creativity when you're in these really difficult, adverse conditions. You know, like art was so important to her that she found a way to continue to make art when she was in this situation, which was quite dire. And we also have the papers of Chiaro Ubada, who actually founded an art school for the members of the camp. And, you know, that's a really beautiful notion to me about what you can do with art. And another one of my favorites that I absolutely love is a sketch of Walt Whitman by Naola Haida. It's just such a beautiful sketch. The colors are so warm, and it depicts Whitman wearing this sort of hat with birds and butterflies and fish coming out of his beard. And it was probably inspired by an ode to Walt Whitman written by Federico Garcia Lorca, where he says, "Not a single moment, lovely old man, Walt Whitman, have I ceased to see your beard full of butterflies." And it just always, I just find it so aesthetically beautiful, but also the connection to Lorca.
Yeah.
And Ojeda also illustrated poems of Pablo Neruda, who was very close to Lorca. My friend Mark Eisner wrote a biography of Pablo Neruda, and you may know that Lorca was assassinated during the Spanish Civil War. And I remember reading the book. I mean, the passages about Neruda's and Lorca's friendship were so beautiful that after he was killed in the narrative of the book, I had to put it down for a little while and take a break because I was like very sad about it. But it's just such a stunning image. I like to talk about it whenever I have a chance to. We have many publications that sort of capture some of our best highlights, which is an undertaking when you have like 30 million items in your collection, but there are lots and lots of special things at the archives. And you know, working with all of these collections of artists, I mean, in my office, we all have some of like our own special collections where you feel like you know the people because you've worked with the collection so much, or like they're your friends. Maybe that's a parasocial thing like social media, but I mean, you're actually holding their diaries and their words and their work and their sketches, and it's such a gift to be able to make that available to scholars and the public and the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So our listeners might know this by now, but we have a question that we bring back for each guest. Elizabeth, feel free to be as expansive as you want. It's very open-ended. But here's the question. What project would you do if you had unlimited funding and time?
Oh, gosh. Well, my friend Joanna Nevis, who's a curator and writer, we have a gentlewoman's agreement that if one of us ever wins the Powerball, we'll open an independent press.
That's it.
There you
That's
go.
the power.
That's
That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elizabeth, for being with us today.
Yes, thank you so much.
It was my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to wrap up with a couple thank yous. Thank you to Sky Park Tausig, our amazing producer. Thank you to Taras Matla at the University of Maryland Art Gallery, and Jonathan Furmansky for letting us use your music.
And thank you to our listeners for accompanying us today with Elizabeth. We will be back with a new episode in 2 weeks, but this is it for this time.
See you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye.
We are The Art Equation. You can find us wherever you listen every other Thursday.
Thanks for being here with us. We'd really love to hear your thoughts. So please subscribe. And if you have a moment to leave a review, it really helps us out. We love the feedback. Talk to you soon here on The Art Equation. The Art Equation is a podcast from Now Be Here with support from the University of Maryland Art Gallery. Now Be Here is a directory and resource created by and for women and non-binary artists. You can find more information at www.nowbehereart.com.